Single-handedly, he defied the cannons and muskets of a mighty empire, clad only in intricately carved wooden armor. This massive state apparatus had swallowed up Siberia in a matter of decades, but unexpectedly found itself stymied by a handful of proud forest warriors. Military commanders sent armed fleets 3 times to break his resistance and claim these gunpowder-rich lands. Each time, this incredible tactician flatly refused to surrender, defending his ancient world with terrifying tenacity. But what actually happened to Chief Catlian when Russian muskets fired point blank at him? Today's story comes to us from a viewer named Michael from Seattle, Washington. He writes, "Dear author, my great-grandfather often told me a legend about the indigenous people of Alaska who wore bulletproof armor made of wood and were able to halt the advance of the Russian pioneers." Well, Michael, thank you so much for this amazing suggestion for today's story. I can say with confidence that the reality of this brutal battle turned out to be far darker and more surprising than any old legend. So buckle up, folks. We're heading out on a very cold and dangerous journey to the wild north. Our story takes place in June 1802 on Baranof Island, where the Mikhailovsky Redoubt was founded. In those days, Alaska was a completely unexplored and deadly frontier, hidden behind thick fog. This harsh land demanded incredible endurance from the settlers, for the winters here were accompanied by biting winds and icy storms. The local storms were so powerful that they could easily toss even large ships onto the rocks. By all accounts, only people with iron character and unyielding will could survive in such conditions. Our main character, an experienced Russian hunter and pioneer named Abrosim Plotnikov, was just such a man. Abrosim was a stocky man with a thick blonde beard and calloused hands, accustomed to hard labor. Local hunters respected him for his exceptional marksmanship and his ability to move silently through the dense coniferous forest. The trappers said he could track an animal by a barely noticeable flattened patch of moss or a broken twig. It seems to me that within a radius of hundreds of miles, there was no one who understood the habits of fur-bearing animals better than he did. His daily task was to harvest the precious skins of sea otters, which in those years were worth their weight in gold. This grueling work drained all his physical strength, forcing him to spend days on end in the icy water in flimsy boats. Hunters had to lie in wait for the wary walrus for long periods amid the cold waves and treacherous coastal reefs. The hunters' hands were constantly freezing and covered with painful cracks from the salt water and the biting north wind. A single careless stroke of the oar could easily capsize the boat, dooming a man to instant death in the icy abyss. But fear gave way to the necessity of fulfilling the arduous plan to harvest valuable fur. But the main meaning in Abrosim's life remained his family, patiently awaiting his return in his distant homeland. He often thought of his caring wife Anna and their 2 mischievous little boys, whose voices constantly echoed in his memory. In moments of particularly intense longing, he imagined his warm family home and the smell of freshly baked rye bread. In the evenings, sitting by the smoking hearth in the damp barracks, he carved small wooden toys for them. He carefully selected soft woods for this, so that the figures would be smooth and pleasant to the touch. These tiny figures of bears and seals were his only comfort after long weeks of hard fishing. He dreamed of earning enough money to one day return home and give his family a tight hug. Abrosim hoped to save up a small fortune that would ensure a decent future for his sons in their home province. Every wooden toy he crafted brought him closer to the cherished day of his long-awaited return home. For the sake of this simple human dream, he was ready to endure any hardship in this wild corner of the earth. Life inside the Mikhailovsky Redoubt was incredibly austere and devoid of any of the comforts familiar to modern people. The hunters huddled in cramped wooden structures that always smelled of dampness, fish oil, and unwashed bodies. In these cramped, dimly lit rooms, icy drafts constantly blew through the cracks in the log walls. It was extremely difficult to heat such structures, so people often slept fully clothed in their winter gear. The only source of heat was a simple stove, which was stoked with damp spruce wood, filling the room with acrid smoke. Their main diet consisted of tough ukola, that is dried salmon, which had to be soaked for a long time before eating. Sometimes a little rye flour of the lowest quality or spoiled grain was added to this meager diet. Fresh vegetables were considered an unheard-of luxury here, and due to a lack of vitamins, many pioneers suffered from scurvy. People began to lose their teeth, their joints weakened, and the slightest physical exertion caused severe pain. It is impossible for a modern person to imagine how these people went months without clean clothes or a hot bath. The redoubt itself was a small fortification surrounded by a high palisade of massive spruce logs. The tops of these logs were sharpened to a point, forming a formidable barrier against any uninvited guest. From the outside, the fortress looked like an impregnable wooden castle rising in the midst of the wild and harsh northern taiga. Inside were barns for storing furs, a small smithy, and living quarters for the company's workers. In the smithy, a heavy hammer clanged from morning till night, forging arrowheads and nails. Wooden towers stood proudly at the corners of the fortress, each housing several heavy copper cannons. These cannons had been brought with great difficulty from Okhotsk on small sailing ships across the stormy ocean. The cannons served as the main line of defense against any enemies who dared to attack the Russian settlement. The thunder of cannon fire always struck terror into the hearts of the forest dwellers, unaccustomed to such a roar and destructive force. None of the colonists could have even imagined that this imposing defense would one day collapse like a house of cards. Endless, dark forests stretched around the redoubt, where the tribes of the mighty Tlingit had lived for centuries. These Native Americans were natural-born warriors, skilled seafarers, and ruthless masters of the entire northwestern coast. They knew every hidden path in the impenetrable taiga and every secret cove along the coast. The forest provided them with everything they needed to survive, from sturdy timber for their homes to game and medicinal berries. They viewed outsiders as dangerous invaders who had encroached upon their sacred ancestral territory. They built massive war canoes from single-seater trunks, capable of holding dozens of armed rowers. These boats were distinguished by their incredible speed and maneuverability in rough waters, even during strong tides. Their social structure was characterized by a complex hierarchy, and respect within the tribe was earned solely through bravery and battle. Accumulated grievances compelled the young warriors to take up their fearsome weapons and war clubs with increasing frequency. Russian traders attempted to establish a fragile peace with them, exchanging iron axes and beads for precious furs. However, the tension between the uninvited guests and the proud masters of the land grew steadily with each passing month. Minor skirmishes on the hunting trails occurred more and more frequently, escalating into open, bloody conflicts. The Tlingit watched with growing irritation as the outsiders barbarically slaughtered sea otters on their ancestral hunting grounds. For the Native Americans, the sea otter was not merely a source of fur, but a sacred animal, deeply revered in their ancient legends. The extermination of this animal was perceived by the local inhabitants as a true sacrilege and a direct insult to their forest gods. Moreover, Russian industrialists often behaved rudely and arrogantly, showing no regard for local customs. They took what belonged to the Native Americans without asking and treated the tribal elders with contempt. The great chief Catlian, who led the Kiksadi clan, began secretly uniting the scattered tribes into a single powerful alliance. He possessed an outstanding intellect, oratorical skills, and an unyielding hatred for the rude newcomers. He understood perfectly well that if these palefaces were not stopped now, his people would lose their native shores forever. In May 1802, the atmosphere around the settlement became so thick you could cut it with a knife. A premonition of impending tragedy literally hung in the air, and even the birds seemed unusually quiet. Local women living with Russian hunters began to whisper anxiously about the coming great calamity. They tried to hint to their husbands about the looming danger, but the men merely brushed off these anxious conversations. In the forest, strange ritual symbols carved into the trees with sharp Native American knives were being found with increasing frequency. But the garrison commanders arrogantly ignored these obvious warnings, placing too much blind faith in the power of their guns. They were certain that the high stockade and their supply of gunpowder would protect them from any unforeseen threat. They considered the Indians to be nothing more than disorganized savages who would never dare to launch an open attack on the fortress. The redoubt commanders' complacency bordered on madness, for they had not even posted additional sentries on the distant approaches to the stockade. The settlement continued to live its usual, measured life until the storm clouds above them finally thickened. Abrasim Plotnikov also sensed this invisible threat hanging in the cold ocean air. Every night he woke at the slightest rustle outside the window, instinctively reaching for his loaded musket. His hunter's instincts, honed by years of survival in the taiga, were literally screaming of an approaching mortal danger. He tried to warn his superiors, but his words only drew condescending smirks from the self-assured officers. No one wanted to believe that a handful of natives could challenge representatives of a mighty empire. And so mid-June arrived, bringing with it a deceptive warmth in the short northern nights. People went about their daily routines, mending their gear and preparing for the new fishing season. The air smelled of blooming pine needles, salt water, and fresh shavings from the carpenter's workshop. Everything around seemed so peaceful and serene that the anxieties of the previous weeks began to gradually subside. But this was only that most terrifying, absolute calm that always precedes a devastating storm. June 20th, 1802, turned out to be an exceptionally clear and sunny day for rainy Alaska. The air was crisp and fresh, and not a single dark cloud was to be seen in the sky. Most of the garrison's defenders had left the redoubt to go on a long-distance hunting expedition for sea otters. Only a few dozen men remained inside the wooden fortress, along with women and children playing. It seemed that nothing on this beautiful Sunday morning foreshadowed the impending, large-scale and bloody tragedy. At that time, Abrasim Plotnikov was in a meadow outside the fortress walls, inspecting old boats. He was slowly caulking the cracks in the wooden hull, enjoying the rare warmth of the northern sun on his back. Suddenly, his keen ear picked up a strange, growing rumble coming from the dark forest thicket. This sound was nothing like the usual rustling of the wind in the treetops or the growl of a wild beast. It was the rhythmic, terrifying pounding of hundreds of feet, accompanied by the ominous shouts and war songs of the Indians. The man straightened abruptly, tossed his heavy work tools aside, and peered intently into the thick, gloomy shadows of the tall ship pines. At this twilight hour, the taiga seemed deceptively quiet, but the experienced hunter immediately sensed something was wrong from the birds that had suddenly fallen silent. From the thickets of lush ferns, dozens, and then hundreds, of warriors painted in bright war paint suddenly began to emerge silently. They seemed to have woven themselves from the mist itself, filling the entire visible space between the ancient trees. And as Abrasim stood motionless, watching this eerie spectacle, his blood literally ran cold in his veins from a primal, indescribable terror. The Indians were not dressed in the soft furs or light leather capes that the Russians were accustomed to seeing during trade. The attackers' bodies were encumbered with heavy, fearsome armor, skillfully crafted from thick wooden planks and sturdy sinews. This armor covered their torsos with a thick protective layer, making the warriors resemble some kind of unseen forest monsters. On their heads were huge, terrifying masks of bears, Arctic wolves, and predatory ravens, completely concealing any human faces. Through the slits in these snarling wooden muzzles, cold and determined eyes stared at the stunned hunter. At the head of this merciless wooden army marched the great chieftain Catlian himself, standing out noticeably from the rest due to his gigantic stature. His imposing figure inspired awe even in his own warriors, who obeyed his every gesture without question. A heavy ritual helmet mask in the shape of a huge, ominous black raven with an open beak was firmly secured to his head. In his strong hands, he clutched not a simple wooden spear or a bone tomahawk, but a real heavy iron blacksmith's hammer. This hammer had likely been secretly stolen from a workshop or traded for from the Russian settlers themselves during past dealings. The chief froze for a second at the edge of the forest, raised his fearsome weapon high, and let out a deafening, piercing war cry. This cry sent a shudder through the entire area, and a huge crowd of warriors, with furious shouts, rushed like an avalanche to storm the defenseless fortress. The ground literally hummed beneath the feet of hundreds of running Indians, eager to drive the strangers from their native land forever. At that moment, it became abundantly clear that the fragile peace on the island had come to a bloody and merciless end. A huge wave of attackers was rapidly approaching the wooden walls of the redoubt, leaving no time for thought. Standing beside Abrasim at that fateful moment was his loyal comrade, a very young hunter named Ivan Baturin. The poor lad instantly turned as pale as a sheet. His lips trembled, and with shaking hands he tried to draw his heavy flintlock pistol from his belt. The weapons seemed like a useless toy against the avalanche of painted warriors rolling toward them from the forest. "Buddy, we need to run to the gate right now, or they'll tear us to pieces," the terrified Ivan screamed desperately, his voice breaking into a shriek. He started to dash forward, but his comrade's strong hand stopped him just in time from taking that suicidal step. Abrasim grabbed the guy by the shoulder with a death grip and yanked him sharply toward a small, deep ravine hidden by thick, thorny bushes. "It's too late to go there. They've completely cut off our retreat. Let's hide in the woods," he commanded in a hoarse voice, strained to the limit. The hunter knew that in the open, they would be spotted and destroyed the very first second of this mad dash. They had to lie low, blend into the ground, and rely solely on the mercy of the forest spirits and the thick undergrowth. They literally slid down to the bottom of the ravine, trying not to make any unnecessary noise or snap any branches. The hunters had barely managed to dive safely into the thick undergrowth when the Indians, with a wild roar, crashed like an avalanche against the redoubt's closed wooden gates. The defenders of the fort, who remained inside, finally recovered from the shock and, in a state of complete panic, opened haphazard fire from their muskets through the narrow defensive embrasures. Loud, dry shots echoed across the quiet coastal cove, startling the rare seabirds. In an instant, the heavy palisade was shrouded in a thick, suffocating cloud of gray, acrid gunpowder smoke, through which the outlines of the attackers were barely visible. The Russian bullets flew true to their mark, whistling as they cut through the damp air and striking the chests of the advancing Tlingit warriors with a dull, terrifying thud. It seemed that such a dense barrage of lead should have immediately halted any advance and forced the enemy to retreat in panic back into the forest. But then something utterly unbelievable happened, causing the defenders on the walls to shudder with a mystical, soul-chilling fear. Instead of falling dead, the Indians continued to run forward, as if protected from the bullets by their tribe's shamans. Lead bullets capable of piercing thick bear hide or felling a large moose at close range simply bounced off the attackers' wooden armor with a clang. These sturdy jackets, made of tightly fitted slats of hardwood covered with leather, functioned as true body armor of that harsh era. The wood absorbed all the devastating kinetic energy of the shot, cracking only slightly but saving the warrior's life. To the terrified Russian riflemen, it looked like real witchcraft against which their weapons proved powerless. The Indians continued their relentless advance in orderly formation, paying no heed to the continuous hail of lead flying from the redoubt's walls. They moved in coordinated groups, not giving the defenders a chance to reload their cumbersome muskets. The attackers deftly threw long assault ladders over the high palisade and, like agile forest cats, swiftly scrambled upward. Within just a few minutes, the first Tlingit warriors, with daggers drawn, were already leaping into the courtyard of the terrified Russian settlement. Inside the fortress, a brutal and chaotic hand-to-hand battle broke out, the outcome of which seemed inevitable.
Retreat now!
Inside the redoubt, all hell instantly broke loose, filled with screams of terror and the clang of clashing weapons. The Tlingits mercilessly slaughtered everyone who crossed their path, sparing neither the old nor the young. They hacked down doors with axes, hurling flaming torches made of resinous bark into the wooden barracks. The fire rapidly engulfed the dry buildings, turning the fortress into one giant, blazing funeral pyre. Acrid black smoke rose high into the heavens, obscuring the bright sun on that fateful day. Abraham and Ivan, hiding in a damp ravine, watched in horror as their comrades perished. Every death cry echoed with unbearable pain in their hearts, but they were utterly powerless to help. Any careless movement would mean certain and agonizing death by Indian spears. They tried not even to breathe loudly, pressing themselves into the cold, damp earth of the Alaskan forest. At that moment, all their dreams of returning to their families seemed infinitely distant and naive. The battle did not last long. The forces of the defenders and the fiercely advancing avengers were too unequal. In just a couple of hours, the impregnable Mikhailovsky redoubt was completely captured, looted, and set ablaze. Chief Catlian stood triumphantly on the ruins, clutching his blood-stained trophy hammer in his hand. He had proven to everyone that his people were capable of defending their homeland against any foreign invaders. As for the two surviving hunters in the ravine, all they could do was wait for darkness to fall so they could try to escape. When the saving night mist finally descended upon the island, Abrasim and Ivan cautiously emerged from their hiding place. They trudged through the dense forest, guided only by the faint light of the stars filtering through the treetops. The air was still thick with the smell of smoke and spilled blood, reminding them of the day's nightmare. The men did not utter a word, afraid of attracting the attention of the Indian patrols scouring the area. Their sole goal was to reach the coast, where other survivors of the massacre might be hiding. The next morning, they did indeed stumble upon a small group of exhausted, terrified settlers. The people were hiding in the coastal cliffs, shivering from the biting northern cold in utter despair. The people had little time for long sympathies and tears, for danger was still breathing down their necks. Abrasim, as the most experienced among them, immediately took on the role of leader in this desperate struggle for survival. He began organizing the gathering of edible shellfish and seaweed to at least somewhat sustain the strength of the exhausted people. Meanwhile, the terrible news of the fall of the proud redoubt began to spread rapidly along the entire coast. Rumors spread faster than the creaking of cartwheels on a bustling market day on the mainland. Native American tribes carried the news of Catlian's great victory from village to village, using messengers and canoes. For the indigenous people, this signaled the start of a large-scale, organized uprising against the Russian fur traders. Suddenly, all the small trading posts and fur trading cooperatives found themselves in a deadly, besieged trap. Salvation for the handful of survivors on Baranov Island came from a completely unexpected source. A few days later, a foreign merchant ship under the command of British Captain Henry Barber unexpectedly entered the bay. Seeing the smoking ruins where the fortress had stood, he immediately sent out armed boats to search for survivors. The sailors discovered the emaciated Abrasim and his companions and hurriedly brought them aboard the rescue vessel. Barber even managed to ransom some of the captive women from the Tlingit, exchanging them for cloth and metal goods. When news of the disaster finally reached Kodiak Island, where the company's headquarters were located, a storm erupted. The chief governor of the Russian colonies, the stern Alexander Baranov, flew into an indescribable, crushing rage. The loss of the Mikhailovsky Redoubt was not merely a military setback, but a colossal blow to the prestige of the entire empire. In addition, the company suffered massive financial losses, having lost a vast amount of precious furs. Baranov swore on the Bible that he would retake the island and take brutal revenge on the Indians for every comrade killed. The official reaction in distant St. Petersburg was not long in coming either, causing shock at the imperial court. Ministers refused to believe that their professional soldiers had been defeated by savages with wooden spears. Fragmentary reports of the tragedy leaked to the press, and newspapers began writing about the bloodthirsty natives of America. Tsar Alexander I personally ordered a military sloop under the command of Yuri Lysyansky to be sent to aid the colonists. It was an unprecedented move, demonstrating just how seriously the empire took this sudden threat at the edge of the world. But while warships were sailing from Russia, strange additional events began to unfold around this story. The surviving hunters, in their testimony, mentioned one extremely disturbing, baffling detail of the battle. It turned out that the Tlingit were armed not only with bows and wooden clubs, but also with excellent European muskets. Moreover, some of the Indians fired from small portable cannons mounted on their war canoes. This discovery deepened the mystery, since the natives could not possibly have manufactured such complex firearms on their own. Tension in the Russian settlements grew with each passing day, turning people's lives into a constant nightmare. Trappers were now terrified to go out hunting, expecting an ambush behind every thick bush. The lucrative fur trade had practically come to a complete halt, leaving the warehouses completely empty. The company's financial revenues were plummeting into an abyss, threatening the entire colonial enterprise with complete bankruptcy. The great and mighty empire was literally losing control of its American possessions right before our eyes. Baranov launched his own investigation, interrogating every loyal local guide. He sent spies to neighboring tribes trying to uncover the source of the enemy's firearms. The threads of this tangled web slowly but surely led to foreign merchant ships that frequently called at these waters. It became clear that someone was deliberately and systematically arming the Tlingit, preparing them for a large-scale war with the Russians. And this mysterious sponsor possessed vast financial resources and access to the most modern military arsenals. The situation had reached a boiling point. The ring of enemies was closing in. the invisible puppet master continued his game. Baranov was assembling a new army. A decisive battle was absolutely inevitable. Before we move on to solving this historical mystery, let me give you one piece of useful advice. Give the one you love peace of mind and safety with a professional survival kit from our partners at Frontier Gear. This convenient and lightweight backpack contains absolutely everything you need for any emergency situation in the wilderness. It includes a reliable fire starter, a heavy-duty knife, and a warm emergency blanket capable of keeping you warm in an icy blizzard. Just click the link in the description below this video to get an exclusive discount for our viewers. And so, debates about this moment have continued in historical circles for many decades. People put forward all sorts of theories, sometimes utterly fantastical, about how savages could have routed a regular garrison. Scholars, military experts, and ordinary folks have been at loggerheads trying to find a logical explanation for this phenomenon. Every researcher felt it was their duty to propose their own unique version of the events that took place in Alaska. Let's briefly examine the three most popular hypotheses that stirred the public's imagination in those years. The first theory, popular among simple, superstitious sailors, held that the Native Americans were aided by powerful dark spirits. People seriously believed that Tlingit shamans had summoned ocean demons to their aid, and that these demons deflected the Russian bullets. Stories of walking bears with human eyes and flying werewolves were whispered in port taverns. This mystical version fit perfectly into the worldview of 19th century people, who were accustomed to believing in the supernatural. However, it did not satisfy serious researchers seeking rational, material causes for the defeat. The second hypothesis placed all the blame solely on the negligence and incompetence of Alexander Baranov himself. His detractors claimed that he skimped on gunpowder, failed to train his men, and ignored the rules of fortification. They believed that the redoubt was built from rotten logs, and the defenders were constantly drunk on cheap rum. In their opinion, any mob, even the most primitive one armed with clubs, could have easily taken such a mediocre fortress. But this version was shattered by the facts, as surviving witnesses unanimously attested to the attackers' incredible organization. A third, more pragmatic theory suggested outright betrayal on the part of American and British traders. Even Captain Barber himself was suspected, as he had so conveniently and timely found himself at the scene of the terrible tragedy. Many believed that he had organized the raid himself in order to later profitably sell the Russians their own rescued people. This version had a certain logical basis, given the fierce competition in the fur trade. The Anglo-Saxons did indeed dream of ousting the Russian company from the fur-rich northern shores of America. But if you really want to know the truth, the story turned out to be far more complex and multifaceted. The secret of the Tlingits' invincibility lay in a brilliant combination of their ancient traditions and modern capitalist realities. When Lysyansky arrived in Alaska and the Russians launched a counteroffensive in 1804, they captured war trophies. After carefully examining the Native Americans' wooden armor left on the battlefield, the officers were amazed by its construction. These were true engineering masterpieces, crafted from the hardest types of wood and tightly bound with sinew. This armor, known as kuyaks, was indeed impervious to the lead bullets fired from the smoothbore muskets of the time. It dispersed the kinetic energy of the impact, leaving the warrior virtually unharmed after a direct hit. But this was not because the natives used magic or dark shamanic sorcery. It was because their craftsmen had spent centuries perfecting woodworking techniques to protect against stone arrowheads. When firearms appeared, they simply thickened the layers and added metal plates made from contraband materials. As for cannons and modern muskets, Alexander Baranov's worst fears were confirmed here. American smugglers from Boston, known locally as the Bostonians, established a steady supply of weapons to the tribes. In exchange for sea otter pelts, they gave the Indians barrels of the finest gunpowder, lead, and even light artillery pieces. It was these American traders who taught the Catlians the basics of European military tactics and firing in ranks. In essence, the Russian Empire in Alaska faced not savages, but a well-armed Allied army of the United States. This defeat at the Mikhailovsky Redoubt forever changed the course of history across the entire North American continent. The Russians eventually recaptured the island and built a new fortress, Novoarkhangelsk. But the myth of their invincibility was shattered. The Tlingit retreated to the mountains and continued to wage a bloody guerrilla war for many decades to come. They attacked isolated boats, killed sentries, and kept the colony in a state of constant, exhausting stress. The Russian company had to spend enormous sums to maintain a large military garrison and repair the fortifications. Eventually, in the high offices of St. Petersburg, very uncomfortable financial questions began to be asked. Maintaining overseas colonies constantly under attack by well-armed local tribes had become completely unprofitable. Officials realized that holding these vast territories with a handful of soldiers was simply physically impossible. Alaska had turned into a bottomless pit, swallowing up state funds with no visible return or bright prospects. It was precisely this stubborn resistance by the freedom-loving Native Americans that became the first crack in the foundation of Russian America. 65 years after the attack on the redoubt, the empire, weary of constant losses, made a radical decision. In 1867, Russia finally surrendered and sold all of Alaska to the United States of America for a pittance. The proud warriors in wooden armor accomplished the impossible, as they forced a vast empire to retreat across the ocean. This story proves that technological superiority does not always guarantee victory over people defending their homeland. Is it possible that somewhere in the old trunks of Tlingit families, captured Russian metals are still kept to this day? That's the story, my friends. Now you know the rest of the tale of that great confrontation in Alaska. I want to express my deepest gratitude to Michael from Seattle for sending us this amazing local legend. Be sure to send your own historical finds and stories to my email. I enjoy reading them. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel to hear more true stories about the settlement of the American frontier.